Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the macabre history of the Hensley family that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know, where are you listening to this story from? That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the autumn of 1911, the heart of America beat with a quiet, steady rhythm. And nowhere was this pulse more serene than in Greene County, Iowa. This was a land sculpted by diligence and faith, a patchwork of prosperous farms passed down through generations, each sustained by the sweat of the brow and the strength of a man's word. Just weeks before the first frost, the annual county harvest fair had drawn families from every corner of the region under a brilliant blue sky. The air was thick with the sweet scent of candied apples and the proud display of prize-winning livestock. The Hensley family had been there, a perfect portrait of contentment. Florence had won a blue ribbon for a strawberry rhubarb pie, her laughter echoing as neighbors offered their congratulations. Mrs. Agnes Thompson, their closest neighbor, had remarked how Florence seemed to glow with health that day. Edward, ever the respectable community man, had spent the afternoon helping repair a faulty gear on the Ferris wheel, earning nods of gratitude. And Clara, her face bright with youthful joy, had shared lemonade with her friends, her future as wide and promising as the Iowa horizon itself. It was the last, perfect memory, a snapshot of a life about to be irrevocably shattered. Amidst this golden landscape of rolling hills and endless cornfields, the Hensley farm stood, a property that, to any passing observer, seemed the very embodiment of the American dream, a testament to hard work, piety, and the unbreakable bonds of family. The air carried the scent of damp earth after the harvest, of hay, and of wood smoke drifting from chimneys, a symphony of contentment and order. But there were older whispers in this land, folk tales told by the first settlers about the soil itself. They said the Iowa earth was so rich it could grow anything, but also so deep and dark it could bury anything, swallowing secrets whole until they were forgotten by all but the land itself. That autumn, the old-timers noted with a certain unease that the crows had been gathering in unusual numbers, their black forms stark against the pale sky, a traditional omen of a long, hard winter and a sorrow to come. But what happens when the very foundation of respectability is merely a facade for a living hell? What terrors can fester in the soil of absolute trust beneath the placid silence of Iowa's golden fields? A story was taking root, a nightmare so profound it would challenge the very notion of community and human decency. How many unheard screams are absorbed by the earth? How many secrets can be buried just beneath the surface of a perfect life? This is not merely a story of a crime hidden behind a single wall. It is the chronicle of a horror concealed for over a decade by a carefully constructed fortress of lies, a fortress the entire community had unwittingly helped to build, brick by brick. To understand how such a malignancy could grow undetected, one must first understand the world that nurtured it. Greene County in the early 20th century was more than a location. It was a state of mind. It was a world governed by unwritten laws. Chief among them, the sanctity of the family unit and the unquestionable authority of the patriarch. The community still spoke quietly of the Miller family. A few years prior, Mrs. Miller had fallen into a deep melancholy after the loss of a third child. Neighbors noticed her absence from church, the neglect in her once pristine garden. But Mr. Miller assured everyone it was a private sorrow, a woman's weakness that he, as her husband, would manage in private, when the pastor had gently suggested a visit. Mr. Miller had met him at the property line, his face a mask of cold fury, making it clear that such interference was unwelcome. The pastor retreated, and the community followed suit. 6 months later, she was found in the barn, having taken her own life. The tragedy was mourned as a private failing, a sad but unavoidable outcome, reinforcing the unspoken rule you do not cross a man's threshold with questions about his family. This code of non-interference, born of a desire for harmony and respect, inadvertently forged the perfect crucible for evil. The geographical reality of the place only strengthened these invisible walls. Farms were separated by vast tracts of land, connected by dirt roads that turned to impassable mud with the first heavy rain. The previous winter, a blizzard had buried the county in 4 feet of snow, cutting the Hensley farm off completely for nearly 2 weeks. No mail, no visitors, no connection to the outside world. This isolation bred a fierce independence, but it also meant that a home like the Hensleys was not just a social kingdom, but a physical one, an island where the king's rule was absolute and unobserved. It was a fertile ground where a predator could cultivate his darkness in plain sight. Protected by the very virtues his community held most dear. The silence of the neighbors, their reluctance to question, was not born of malice, but of a deeply ingrained cultural deference. And it was this silence that would allow Edward Hensley's monstrous project to germinate, to grow, and to flourish, completely unchallenged. At the center of this idyllic, yet vulnerable, world was the Hensley family. By all accounts, they were pillars of the Scranton community. Edward Hensley, a robust man of 43, was known throughout the county for his exceptional skill as an agricultural implement mechanic. The ring of his hammer and the clang of metal were part of the daily rhythm of the countryside, a sound of reliability. He was punctual, honest in his dealings, and possessed a quiet, dependable nature that commanded respect. His wife, Florence, was the heart of their home and a beloved presence in the community. At 40, her gentle voice was a staple in the Methodist church choir, and her kindness was legendary. Yet, even in this perfect home, a subtle tension had begun to surface. The week before Florence fell ill, she had suggested that Clara, now 16, should be allowed to attend a church social with her friends. "She's growing up, Edward," Florence had said gently. "She needs to spend time with people her own age." Edward had looked up from his newspaper, his expression unreadable. "Her place is here. There's work to be done," he'd replied, his tone flat and final. For a fleeting moment, Florence saw a flicker of something cold and possessive in his eyes, a brief, unsettling glimpse of the man behind the mask. The conversation was dropped, but the unease lingered. A few days later, a letter arrived for Clara from her best friend, Sarah, inviting her for a weekend stay. Edward got the mail that day. Clara never saw the letter. He simply told her later that Sarah had sent her regards, but was too busy with chores to visit. And then there was Clara. Born in 1895, the couple's only daughter was on the cusp of womanhood, inheriting her mother's serene beauty and her father's quiet intelligence. She dreamed of becoming a teacher, a simple, noble ambition that reflected the wholesome world she knew. But in October of 1911, the first imperceptible crack appeared in this perfect facade. Florence was suddenly struck by a strange and aggressive illness. From Clara's perspective, it was a terrifying whirlwind of confusion. One day, her mother was singing while baking. The next, she was unable to sit up. Clara tried to tend to her, to bring her cool cloths and read to her from the Bible. But her father was a constant, controlling presence. He intercepted her at the bedroom door, insisting Florence needed absolute quiet. He managed every visit from the doctor, speaking in low, serious tones outside the room, then relaying only snippets of information to Clara. "The doctor says it's a fever of the blood," he would explain calmly, his hand on her shoulder. "We must be strong and not tire her with questions." The home, once filled with song, now fell into a stifling silence, broken only by weak moans and the scent of medicine that never seemed to work. Dr. Harry Price, the local physician, was summoned to the farm. After a brief examination, he delivered a diagnosis that, in that era, was both common and terrifying typhoid fever. He noted the high fever, the weakness, the nausea, all classic signs. Yet, for a brief moment, he felt a flicker of professional doubt. Florence's headaches, as described by Edward, seemed unusually severe, and there was a peculiar lack of the rash that often accompanied typhoid. But he dismissed it. Edward was a picture of a concerned husband, providing detailed, plausible answers. To question a man of his standing, in his own home, during a time of crisis, felt like an overstep. And besides, typhoid was, after all, sweeping through the region. It was easier and more socially acceptable to trust the obvious explanation than to chase a fleeting anomaly. And so, the diagnosis was accepted without question, and the community grieved as one when, 3 days later, Florence Hensley was dead. Her funeral was a somber affair, attended by nearly everyone in town, all there to support the devastated husband and his inconsolable 16-year-old daughter. No one could have imagined that the cause of death was not a fever born of contaminated water, but a cold, calculated plan born in the heart of the man who wept most convincingly at her coffin. The diagnosis was not just a medical error. It was the first masterstroke in a long and meticulous campaign of deception. It was the perfect, respectable explanation for a horrifying truth. A truth that was now buried with Florence, deep in the consecrated ground of the Methodist cemetery. When Clara woke, it was to a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight. The cloying sweetness of ether still clung to the back of her throat, and a dull, throbbing ache pulsed behind her eyes. For a few disoriented moments, she believed she was in her own bed, trapped in a fever dream, but the air was wrong stale, cold and thick with the smell of damp earth and new mortar. Her hands flew out, searching for the familiar comfort of a quilt, and instead met the rough, unyielding chill of a stone wall. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her confusion. She scrambled off the simple wooden cot, her bare feet landing on a cold dirt floor. Her hands explored the suffocating confines of her world, a small rectangular space, walled in on all sides. Then she found it the door, a solid, seamless barrier of iron, cold to the touch, with no handle, no knob, no latch on her side. The reality of her situation crashed down upon her with the force of a physical blow. She screamed, a raw, primal sound of terror and disbelief, and hammered her fists against the unmoving iron until her knuckles were raw and bleeding. Her cries were swallowed by the insulated walls, echoing back at her in the suffocating darkness, a terrifying duet with her own despair. Above her, in the quiet farmhouse, Edward Hensley heard the muffled screams from the basement. He paused his work, listening with an impassive expression. He had psychologically prepared himself for this moment, steeling his nerves against the inevitable resistance. In his twisted mind, This was not cruelty. It was unnecessary, albeit unpleasant. Step to ensure Clara's safety and his absolute control. He waited until the frantic banging subsided, replaced by the sound of exhausted sobs, before calmly ascending the stairs to begin the second, and arguably most brilliant, phase of his plan. The next morning, he hitched his horse to his buggy and drove into Scranton, his face a mask of carefully crafted devastation. He went directly to the office of the local sheriff, a man who had known the Hensley family for years. Edward, his voice breaking, recounted a story he had rehearsed to perfection. Clara, he explained, had run away during the night. He spoke of a young, charming seed salesman who had passed through the region the previous week, suggesting Clara had become infatuated and had fled to join him. The story was tragically plausible. It was not unheard of for a young woman, especially one grieving the recent loss of a parent, to be swept away by promises of a new life in a bustling city. Edward wept during the conversation, dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief, claiming he felt consumed by guilt for not having noticed the signs, for not having been a more attentive father in his own grief. The community, already sympathetic to his plight, reacted with an outpouring of support and understanding. First, he had lost his beloved wife, and now his only daughter had abandoned him. The tragedy of Edward Hensley became a tale whispered with pity in the general store, a name prayed for in the pews of the Methodist Church. Neighbors offered to form such parties, but Edward politely, yet firmly, declined. He preferred to handle the situation privately, he said, hoping that Clara would come to her senses and return home once she realized her mistake. To cement his narrative, he began the most audacious part of his deception. On his business trips to neighboring towns to procure parts for machinery, he would post letters. These letters, written on common paper bought at Scranton's general store, were supposedly from Clara. For weeks, Edward had sat by lamplight, meticulously practicing his daughter's handwriting, copying from her old-school essays and letters to friends until he could replicate her elegant script almost perfectly. The letters were masterpieces of manipulation, carefully crafted to discourage any search in them. Clara claimed to be happy and well, but deliberately vague about her location, citing a fear that her father would find her and force her to return. She asked that her family and friends respect her decision to start a new life. With each letter that arrived, the community's belief in Edward's story solidified, and the real Clara Hensley, trapped in the darkness beneath their feet, began to fade from a person into a cautionary tale. Weeks turned into months, and the seasons changed above Clara's prison. The initial frantic terror gave way to a desperate, gnawing hope, which in turn slowly eroded into a grim resignation. Her existence became a relentless, monotonous cycle governed by the sliver of light from the high, camouflaged window and the sound of her father's footsteps on the floorboards above. Edward had established a rigid, almost ritualistic, control system. He would descend to the basement once a day, usually in the late afternoon, with a simple tray of food cornbread, cooked beans, a pitcher of water. He spoke to her as if the situation were completely normal, recounting community gossip or complaining about the weather, ignoring her pleas, her tears, and her questions as if she hadn't spoken at all. "You are safe here, Clara," was his standard, chilling response to any protest. "The world outside is full of dangers you cannot comprehend. Here, I can protect you." He had constructed a delusional narrative in which her captivity was an act of supreme paternal love, not a monstrous crime. Any act of defiance was met with calculated cruelty if she screamed too loudly. He would block the small ventilation holes, letting the air grow stale and suffocating for hours if she refused to eat. The food tray would simply not appear the next day. The cruelest punishment, however, was the silence. Sometimes, for weeks on end, he would not speak a word, leaving her food and water through the small slot in the door. Her only human contact, the sight of his hands. During these periods, she was utterly alone. The muffled sounds of her life, she was no longer part of the laughter of visiting clients, the distant ringing of church bells serving as a constant, torturous reminder of everything she had lost. Sarah Mitchell, however, could not let go of the gnawing suspicion that something was terribly wrong. The story of the runaway lover never sat right with her. It wasn't the Clara she knew. She visited the farm several times over the following months, always hoping to glean some new piece of information from Edward. Each time, she was met with the same performance of a grieving father, who would sometimes produce one of the forged letters as proof. Though Sarah couldn't pinpoint a lie, the coldness in his eyes that she had witnessed that first day haunted her. But her concerns, when voiced to others, were dismissed as the fantasies of a heartbroken friend. In a world that revered paternal authority, a young woman's intuition was no match for a respected man's word. The disappearance of Clara Hensley became a settled matter. It was now a local tragedy that, with the passing of time, was mentioned less and less. No one suspected that just meters from their homes, their churches, and their everyday lives, a young woman was being held captive, beginning an ordeal of unimaginable horror that would last for 11 years. As the years bled into one another, Clara developed psychological strategies to survive, to keep her sanity from fracturing in the crushing isolation. She created elaborate routines, marking the passage of time by scratching a small line into the stone wall each morning. She populated her dark world with imaginary companions, recreating happy memories from her childhood and holding long, one-sided conversations with friends she would never see again. She began to sew dolls from scraps of her clothing and threads pulled from a thin blanket, each one given a name and a personality. These rag dolls became her only confidants, silent witnesses to her silent suffering. Then, during the 4th year of her captivity, in 1917, the nature of her imprisonment took an even darker turn. The systematic abuse by her father resulted in a pregnancy. She tried to hide it for as long as she could, terrified of his reaction. But her condition eventually became undeniable. Edward reacted not with rage, but with a disturbing mixture of practical concern and twisted satisfaction. He began bringing her more nutritious food, fresh milk, meat, vegetables from his garden, claiming he wanted to ensure the health of the baby. In 1918, Clara gave birth in the cold darkness of the basement. The child, a girl, was stillborn. Edward showed little emotion, wrapping the tiny body in a cloth and taking it away. He buried it in a remote corner of the property, marking the spot with a single, unidentifiable stone. Clara was devastated, but her grief was a solitary one, unwitnessed and uncomforted. The following year, in 1919, Clara became pregnant again. This time, the baby, a boy, was born healthy. This birth presented Edward not with a problem, but with an opportunity to further embellish his benevolent facade. He took the infant from Clara, brought him upstairs into the light, and introduced him to the world with another masterfully crafted lie. He claimed to have found the baby abandoned on the roadside during a business trip. The community, already primed to see Edward as a charitable, long-suffering man, accepted the story without question. They marveled at his generosity, that a man who had lost so much could still find it in his heart to rescue an orphan. Edward named the boy Thomas and raised him in the main house as his own. The child grew up believing his Uncle Edward was his savior, utterly unaware that his true mother was imprisoned just meters below, her own heart breaking with every faint sound of his laughter that filtered through the floorboards. 2 years later, in 1921, another son, James, was born in the same horrific conditions and integrated into the world with the same lie. Edward Hensley, the respected mechanic, was now seen as a local saint, a man who had opened his home to two abandoned children. His reputation had never been more secure, his dark secret never more deeply buried. In 1922, a fourth child was born into the darkness. It was a girl, and for reasons known only to him, Edward decided this child would remain in the compartment with her mother. He named her Ruth. Her arrival brought a new, excruciating dimension to Clara's suffering. On one hand, she finally had a constant companion, a reason to fight, a tiny soul to pour her long-suppressed love into. On the other, she was forced to watch her daughter grow up in a world defined by stone walls and shadows, deprived of sunlight, proper nutrition, and the simple joys of a normal childhood. Ruth's world consisted of her mother's whispered stories, the flickering light of an oil lamp, and the daily visits from the man she learned to call Grandpa Edward. For 2 years, this grotesque version of family life continued, a secret within a secret, buried even deeper than the lies the community had already accepted. But the carefully constructed system of control that Edward had maintained for more than a decade was about to be undone, not by a police investigation or a neighbor's suspicion, but by the fragile lungs of an innocent child. The harsh winter of 1924 descended upon Greene County with a vengeance, bringing with it a wave of respiratory diseases that swept through the isolated farmsteads. Whooping cough, a highly contagious and often fatal infection for young children, was rampant. Ruth, having spent her entire life in the damp, poorly ventilated air of the secret compartment, was exceptionally vulnerable. Her immune system was severely compromised, and when the infection took hold, it did so with a terrifying speed. Clara watched in growing horror as her daughter was racked by violent, persistent coughing fits that left her breathless, her small body convulsing and her lips turning a deathly shade of blue. She begged Edward during his daily visits, her pleas escalating from desperate whispers to frantic screams, for him to take Ruth to a doctor. But Edward, ever the pragmatist, initially resisted, terrified that exposing the child would raise questions he could not answer. "She'll get better," he insisted, bringing ineffective home remedies. But Ruth only worsened. She lost weight dramatically, her skin becoming as pale and translucent as paper. Edward now faced a terrible dilemma. Taking Ruth to the hospital meant almost certain exposure. But if Ruth died in the compartment, he would not only lose a valuable tool of control over Clara, but explaining the death of a secret child would be an impossible task. On the morning of February 12th, 1924, the choice was made for him. Ruth suffered a particularly severe coughing spell that left her unconscious for several minutes. Clara's screams of pure terror were so piercing that Edward, working in his workshop above, could hear them clearly through the layers of wood and earth. When he descended, he found Ruth limp and barely breathing. Realizing the child was just hours from death, he made the decision that would unravel everything. He carried Ruth out of the compartment, wrapped her in blankets, and for the first time in her life, she was brought into the light of the outside world. He drove her to the Greene County Hospital in Scranton. The irrefutable evidence of his crimes was no longer a secret buried in the earth. It was a living, breathing, dying child. At the hospital, Edward told the head nurse, a sharp, experienced woman named Helen Armstrong, that the child was his goddaughter who had fallen suddenly ill. But as Nurse Armstrong and the attending physician, Dr. Robert Clark, began their emergency treatment, they immediately noticed a host of disturbing details that contradicted Edward's story. The child's critical condition was clearly not sudden. She was suffering from severe, chronic malnutrition. Her bone structure was fragile, and her skin had a strange, almost luminous pallor, as if she had never been exposed to sunlight. She recoiled from the bright hospital lights with a look of terror and shrank away from Edward's touch. Even more peculiar was her speech, though she was too. She spoke only a few words, and she used expressions and grammatical constructions that seemed to belong to an earlier era, as if she had learned to speak from someone who had themselves grown up decades before. Helen Armstrong had worked at that hospital for over 20 years. She vaguely remembered the commotion surrounding the disappearance of Clara Hensley 11 years earlier. As she looked more closely at the sick child, a chilling sense of recognition began to dawn. The resemblance was undeniable. The same distinctive green eyes, the same delicate facial structure, the same light brown hair with natural waves that she remembered. Consulting old hospital records, she found the file on Florence Hensley's death in 1911. The pieces began to click into place, forming a theory so monstrous it seemed impossible. She shared her concerns with Dr. Clark, who had his own suspicions about Edward's vague and inconsistent answers. Together, they contacted Sheriff Walter Briggs. The sheriff arrived at the hospital and listened intently to their observations. He then began a detailed interrogation of Edward. Under Briggs's methodical questioning, Edward's story began to fray at the edges. The dates didn't align. The details about Ruth's supposed mother were too vague, and his nervousness went far beyond that of a concerned guardian. Briggs decided to reopen the Clara Hensley case file. A careful re-examination of the letters Edward had provided over the years revealed what should have been seen long ago. All the letters were written on the same type of paper, with the same ink. Both sold exclusively at the Scranton General Store. More damningly, they were always posted from cities where Edward had recently traveled for business. The handwriting, though similar to Clara's, showed the subtle telltale inconsistencies of a deliberate imitation. The sheriff then discreetly interviewed neighbors. Mrs. Thompson recalled seeing Edward carrying a small child into the house late one night a couple of years earlier. A child who, unlike Thomas and James, was never seen playing in the yard. Armed with this mountain of circumstantial but deeply compelling evidence, Briggs obtained a search warrant for the Hensley property. On the morning of February 18, 1924, the sheriff, accompanied by 2 deputies and an experienced local carpenter named Samuel Morrison, arrived at the farm. Edward tried to remain calm, but his composure was visibly cracking. He allowed them to search the main house and the workshop, but when Briggs announced their intention to inspect the basement, a flicker of pure panic crossed Edward's face before he could suppress it. In the damp, musty basement, Morrison's expert eye immediately noticed what others had missed for years. One section of the stone wall was different. The mortar was a slightly different color, and the stones, while old, had been set more recently than the rest of the foundation. When questioned, Edward claimed he had made structural repairs years ago. Unconvinced, Briggs ordered his deputies to start removing the stones. After several hours of painstaking work, their crowbars struck something hard and unyielding. They cleared away the remaining stones to reveal a heavy, solid iron door, fitted with multiple locks and a small slot for passing food. The discovery was met with a stunned silence. Realizing the game was over, Edward finally, numbly, admitted he had the key. He claimed it was merely for storing valuables. When Sheriff Briggs turned the key and pulled open the heavy door. The stench of stale air and human misery that billowed out was overwhelming. And there, sitting on a simple bed, in the dim light of a single lantern, was a woman. She was emaciated. Her skin was unnaturally pale. Her eyes were wide with terror at the sight of strangers invading her tomb. She was 28 years old, but looked decades older, a ghost of the vibrant young woman who had vanished 11 years before. The walls of her prison were covered in hundreds of small, faded scratches, a heartbreaking calendar of her lost years. Scattered around the room were the rag dolls, her only companions. It was Clara Hensley. Initially terrified, she gradually understood she was being rescued. Her first hoarse words were not for herself, but for her child. Ruth, where is my daughter, Ruth? The discovery sent a shockwave of horror through the officers present, a horror that would soon engulf the entire community. Edward Hensley, the respected farmer, the charitable guardian, the grieving widower, was a monster. His entire life was a lie. The news of what was found in the Hensley basement spread through Greene County like a wildfire. It was a story too horrific to be believed, yet the evidence was undeniable. Clara was immediately taken to the hospital, where she was reunited with Ruth in a sterile, brightly lit room that felt as alien to them both as another planet. The reunion was emotionally devastating, a mother and daughter meeting for the first time as free people, yet both bearing the deep, invisible wounds of their shared trauma. Medical examinations revealed the full extent of their ordeal. Clara was suffering from severe malnutrition, chronic anemia, and profound psychological damage. Ruth, beyond the whooping cough, showed serious signs of developmental delay. Her bone structure was fragile, her immune system critically weak, and she was terrified of open spaces and strangers. Meanwhile, Edward Hensley was arrested and taken to the county jail. During the initial interrogation, he maintained a defiant, almost arrogant attitude, insisting he had only ever acted to protect Clara from the dangers of the outside world. But as Sheriff Briggs presented him with the irrefutable evidence, the secret compartment, Clara's physical state, the testimony of the doctors, his carefully constructed facade, finally crumbled. And then he confessed, in a flat, emotionless monotone. He admitted to everything. He described the 11 years of captivity, the systematic abuse, and the creation of his orphan sons, Thomas and James. And then he delivered the final, shocking revelation. He confessed to the murder of his wife, Florence, 11 years prior. She began asking questions about my behavior with Clara, Edward stated, as transcribed by the court clerk. She threatened to tell the pastor I couldn't allow our family to be destroyed by her unfounded suspicions. He coldly described how he had poisoned her with small doses of arsenic over several weeks before finally suffocating her with a pillow when she became too weak to resist. The full monstrous scope of his crimes was finally laid bare. Edward Hensley's trial, which began in September 1924, was a regional sensation. The small Scranton courtroom was packed every day, with people lining up at dawn for a chance to witness the proceedings. The prosecutor, James Morrison, presented a devastating case. He had Clara's detailed written testimony, physical evidence from the secret compartment, and expert medical testimony on the long-term effects of their captivity. Following the exhumation of Florence's body, forensic reports confirmed she had been poisoned with arsenic. Edward's defense attorney attempted to argue temporary insanity, but the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. The 2-year construction of the secret cell, the decade-long campaign of forged letters, the slow, methodical poisoning of his wife. These were not the acts of a man who had snapped. They were the work of a patient, meticulous predator. Perhaps the most powerful moments of the trial came from the testimonies of the townspeople themselves. Sarah Mitchell, Clara's former best friend, wept on the stand as she recounted her failed attempts to see Clara and the coldness in Edward's eyes. "I knew something was wrong," she testified, her voice thick with guilt, "but I never could have imagined. I feel guilty for not insisting more." Mrs. Thompson also testified, her voice trembling, about the strange sounds she had heard for years. "I always just thought he worked very hard," she said. "Now I realize, if I had only been more curious, maybe Clara could have been saved years earlier." Their words echoed the collective guilt of a community that had been willfully blind. In October 1924, after only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Edward Hensley guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, false imprisonment, and multiple charges of sexual abuse. The judge, a veteran of Iowa's judicial system, described Edward's crimes as among the most depraved and calculated I have witnessed in my career. Edward was sentenced to life in prison. During the reading of the sentence, he remained impassive. His only words, a chilling testament to his unrepentant evil. "I did what I thought was necessary to protect my family." After the trial, a profound and unsettling silence fell over Greene County, a silence far heavier than the one that had allowed Edward Hensley's crimes to fester for so long. The verdict was not a closure, but an indictment of the community itself. The media spectacle eventually moved on, leaving the townspeople alone with their shared shame and the horrifying knowledge of the monster they had called a neighbor, a friend, a pillar of their community. The Hensley farm, now abandoned, became a dark monument on the landscape. Its windows stared out like vacant eyes over the fields, and the property began to decay, an external reflection of the moral rot it had concealed. No one was interested in buying the land. It was tainted, haunted not by ghosts, but by the memory of a living nightmare. For decades, it would be known only as the basement house, a place local children dared each other to approach. Its legend, a dark stain on the county's history. The house was finally demolished in 1967, a desperate attempt to physically erase a memory that could never truly be expunged. But the land remained empty, a scar on the earth, a permanent reminder of the horrors that had transpired there. For Clara and her children, the end of the trial was the beginning of a monumental challenge, rebuilding a life from the ashes of an unimaginable trauma. The world Clara re-entered was not the one she had left. In the 11 years she had been imprisoned, a world war had been fought and won. New technologies like the radio were becoming commonplace, and American society was undergoing profound cultural transformations. At 29, she had to relearn the most basic social skills, adapting to a world that had evolved without her. The Greene County community, in its guilt, reacted with a fervent desire to help. A fundraising campaign was organized by the Methodist Church, and local families offered shelter, clothing, and emotional support. But the constant media attention was almost as traumatic as her captivity. Reporters hounded her. Photographers tried to snap pictures of the children, forcing the family to move several times to escape the public scrutiny. The reunion with her sons, Thomas and James, was a gradual and painful process. These were children who had grown up believing their mother had abandoned them and that their captor was their generous benefactor. The revelation of the truth was a psychological earthquake that shattered their entire reality. They were carefully placed in the care of volunteer church families, while Clara received intensive medical treatment. The process of becoming a family was slow, supervised, and fraught with the complexities of their shared, yet vastly different, traumas. In 1925, seeking anonymity and specialized care, Clara and her children moved to Des Moines. The city offered them a chance to escape the shadow of their past and begin the slow, arduous process of healing. A process that would, in many ways, last the rest of their lives. Edward Hensley died in prison in 1951 at the age of 83, having served 27 years of his life sentence. Official records state that he never expressed remorse for his crimes. He rarely received visitors and spent his final years in near total isolation, shunned even by other inmates due to the depraved nature of his offenses. He took the ultimate secret, the true, deep-seated why behind his monstrous transformation to his grave, leaving behind only a legacy of inexplicable evil. Clara, in stark contrast, lived until 1978, passing away at the age of 83. She never remarried, dedicating her life entirely to raising her children and to her own quiet recovery. In her later years, she became a discreet but powerful advocate for the rights of domestic crime victims, working with local organizations to help other women who had suffered in silence. Despite the horrors she had endured, she managed to find a new purpose in helping others, transforming her own pain into a source of strength and compassion for those who had none. Her children, though forever marked by their origins, managed to build lives of their own. Thomas became a carpenter and James a bank clerk. They led quiet, respectable lives, forever avoiding any publicity about their past, carrying their emotional scars in private. The greatest challenges, however, were faced by Ruth, the daughter born and raised in captivity. The transition to the outside world was a lifelong struggle. Having spent her first years in a claustrophobic space, she developed severe agoraphobia and, for years, found it difficult to be in open spaces or large groups of people. She never fully recovered from the profound psychological and physical effects of her birth and upbringing. Her life was a haunting testament to the enduring, generational legacy of her father's crimes. The Hensley case left an indelible mark on Iowa's criminal justice system, leading to more rigorous protocols for missing person investigations and the creation of specialized programs for victims of prolonged captivity. But its most profound legacy is not in the legal reforms it inspired, but in the dark questions it forces us to confront. The story remains one of the most disturbing in American criminal history, not simply because of the depravity of the crimes, but because of what it reveals about our collective capacity to ignore warning signs when they contradict our social expectations. Edward Hensley's facade of respectability was his most effective weapon. He exploited the natural human tendency to trust those who hold positions of esteem and the cultural reluctance to question paternal authority. His story is a chilling reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often not the ones who lurk in the shadows, but those who hide in plain sight, protected by our own unwillingness to believe that such horrors are possible. How could an entire community be deceived for so long? How could they live their normal, peaceful lives just meters from one of the most heinous crimes imaginable and never suspect the truth? This is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Hensley family saga. It forces us to question the very nature of our own communities, to look at the familiar faces of our neighbors and wonder what secrets lie hidden behind their respectable facades. The Hensley farmhouse may have been demolished, but the lessons of its dark legacy remain terrifyingly relevant. In an age of instant communication and technological surveillance, we want to believe that such crimes are no longer possible. But modern cases of domestic captivity continue to shock the world, proving that the human capacity for evil and deception has not diminished with time. Clara Hensley's story is, in the end, a story of survival against impossible odds. It is a testament to the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. But it is also a warning that we must remain vigilant, that we must be willing to ask uncomfortable questions, and that we must never accept that appearances always reflect reality. For the echo of Clara's screams in that secret basement may have long since fallen silent, but her story continues to resonate, a timeless and terrifying reminder that sometimes the greatest horrors are hidden in the most unexpected of places, waiting only for the right moment to be revealed.